webinar brought to you by CommScope. I am Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief of RCR Wireless News. Today, our guests on this webinar will be Roger Entner from Recon Analytics and Darrell Schooler from Ovum, and we'll be taking a look back at last week's CTIA event in New Orleans, touching on some of the highlights and lowlights, I guess, that we gleaned from the event. The plan for this one-hour webinar is to spend the first half or so discussing the big trends that the three of us took away from the event, leaving the last portion to questions from those of you listening in. For those wanting to ask a question, there is a please use the question tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. We will try to get to as many questions as possible during the question and answer portion of this call. But for those that we don't get to, please feel free to send off specific questions to any of us using the email addresses on the screen. For those of you unfamiliar with RCR, here are some snippets of information for you there. Again, we've been around since '81 covering the wireless industry. So yeah, there's some information there for you guys. As I mentioned earlier, today we are lucky to be joined by a couple of big names from the analyst community. First, I would like to introduce Roger Entner, who, to anyone that has been involved with or read anything about the wireless space over the past decade or so, as I'm sure familiar with. Roger has a long history of covering the wireless space, having held senior positions at a number of analyst firms, including Nielsen, IAG Research, Yankee Group, and Ovum. Roger last year founded his own firm, Recon Analytics, where he continues to provide deep insight and analysis into the mobile space. Also joining us today is Darrell Schooler, who is a principal analyst of network infrastructure at Ovum. As you can see from Darrell's bio, he has an extensive and deep knowledge base in covering the infrastructure segment of the mobile industry and in untangling the mess of acronyms that inhabits that space. That's always something good to have. Previous to his current work at Ovum, Darrell worked at Recon Analytics, at Instat, and as well as experience working at service provider Cable and Wireless USA. The structure for today's discussion will be that we are going to touch on some of the high points from the recent CTIA event in New Orleans. I know many of you might have attended the event, or at least had some of the coverage, and probably a lot more of you were not able to make the trip, but seeing how the event is one of the larger domestic wireless specific events on the calendar, we thought it would make sense during this webinar to take a look at a few of the important trends that came from the show. Here's a quick rundown of what we'll be looking at: network news, some device news, carrier news, and then just a grab back at the end of some of the things that we saw from the event. All right, let's begin. And before we take off for the start of this, I just want to also remind everyone again that if you do have some questions during this webinar, that you can send those in using the question box there on the control panel, on the GoToWebinar control panel there. So feel free to send those in, and like I said, we'll get to some of those questions towards the end of the webinar. All right, so we'll take off here, get going with our first topic, which is looking at some of the network news that came from the show. Obviously, when it comes to wireless, networks are core to the whole system. Probably just second to maybe Spectrum, but there was some interesting news that came from the event, and maybe we'll start off with Darrell. I guess to get your general overview of what you saw from the show this year, maybe some topics that you saw, or some highlights, maybe some lowlights you saw from this year's event.
Sure, thanks. I guess one of the things that struck me first is kind of the lack of news around LTE base stations, particularly, say, the macro base stations, which in many ways, it's actually kind of, the no news is kind of a good sign. I mean, it's a sign that LTE has become mature. I mean, if we step back a couple of years ago, you would have seen a lot of these base stations, net prime real estate space that vendors have right there on the edge of the aisle. They would spend a lot of time talking about them, saying, hey, we got our solution, here it is, it's standard, or whatever their approach to the market is. But when you saw this year's show, really, I mean, when you go through, that kind of infrastructure, a lot of the stuff that I cover was at the back of the booth, which actually is, I think is a very good sign in terms of maturation. It means, that the vendors' solutions become mature. It means that the operators are recognizing LTE. They're recognizing, that hey, that these solutions are coming forward. They are working, and that they're looking to take the next step. And then when you saw the layout of the infrastructure vendors, you see the next step up. That's what's really there on the front of the aisle in terms of things around optimization or monetization, or even going into small cells, which is a lot about spectrum optimization. So it's really talking about what vendors are really kind of pushing and highlighting now is the next step of LTE beyond just say the initial coverage, but how can we make it work better? How can we go back and fill in holes? How do we make money for operators with this?
Yeah, interesting. I guess was there any maybe any disappointments from the show? I mean, you did mention that there was almost like a lack of LTE news, but like you said, that's kind of a good thing. But anything else, I guess, that maybe?
I mean, to get kind of really particular, I mean, I guess I would say surprise and disappointment. I guess surprise in kind of a bad way, I would say, is probably Alcatel-Lucent's absence from the show. Sure, I know that they've done a great job here in North America, particularly in the U.S., in terms of winning contracts with both Tier 1 operators and Tier 2 operators. But the company that's talking about how they want to use small cells to unseat incumbents in areas where they haven't sold the macro base station, and considering how many other people were showing small cells, you would think that Alcatel-Lucent would still want to have a presence at the show, if only to show off their own small cell type solutions in some sort of like defensive type manner. I mean, Ericsson, on the other hand, which has done just as good, if not better, job than Alcatel-Lucent in North America, have a very large presence there, and certainly was very active in talking about their small cell, their HetNet type solution. So I was somewhat surprised that Alcatel-Lucent wasn't there, just at least in terms of defensive posture. And I guess the one I would say that was really disappointing though was ZTE. Just having been at China at their analyst event a couple weeks ago, I mean, they talked up still the importance of winning infrastructure contracts in North America. And here at CTIA, clearly the largest or one of the biggest of all the wireless infrastructure shows there is, they really didn't show me anything in terms of press releases, announcements. Having gone to their booth, you really had to work your way to the back and look hard. I mean, they didn't, if I don't remember, I don't think they even had any infrastructure on display. It was merely just some demos going on in the back of the booth that I think they kind of missed the boat there in terms of trying to step up and expand their presence here.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I don't know, Roger, if you saw much on the network side, maybe if you have some comments on kind of what you saw or what maybe perhaps you even didn't see at the show this year.
Well, I think that the reason why we have seen relatively little from Huawei and CT on the network side is that they're basically condemned to work with the rural carriers, because the GSA, the government services agency, more or less communicated that if you want to win a contract with the government, you better not have Huawei or CTE base station equipment. One of the things that I looked at is how much of, and I would almost say hype is there around small cells. We definitely need more small cells, but they are not the panacea, the solve-it-all of our capacity woes. The laws of physics still apply. We get better and better at understanding them and working around it, but it's not going to magically solve all of our problems.
Yeah, interesting. That's a good point. I guess on the Chinese vendors as well. I know it's been, I think, an issue domestically here with some of the larger carriers. I think it was Sprint at one point who was rumored to be in talks with them to provide some equipment, and that kind of fell through because of government issues there. But yeah, I guess that might have had some impact on that as well. But yeah, it's definitely. I think Darrell too, a good point about the fact that it does seem like that LTE has kind of matured now, and it's almost a good thing that we're not hearing quite so much news just about the technology. That people are pretty comfortable with it. Things are working okay in most situations, save for a couple of hiccups here and there. I guess maybe the next round will be when LTE Advanced starts to roll in a couple of years. It'll be the next jumping off point when it comes to network news at this point. So.
Yeah, yeah, and at the keynotes with all the CEOs of the big four wireless carriers, it was really an LTE love fest. Everybody was proud of LTE and the leadership position that the United States has in that, no matter if they actually have an LTE network or not. Everybody nicely took credit for it.
Yeah, that was one area of harmony among all those guys, wasn't it?
Yes.
That is true. That is true. But well, good. We'll maybe move on to our next topic here, which is kind of looking at some of the device news from the event. Obviously, devices are always a hot topic, and there are some shows earlier in the year that tend to get a lot of device news. I know the Consumer Electronics Show has become pretty important for carriers when it comes to rolling out, and device makers when it comes to rolling out new devices. And it did seem like perhaps at this event there was maybe a lack of news on the device front. I don't know, Roger, if you have a couple of comments on maybe what you saw when it comes to the device market there.
Well, what was really surprising and shocking was the deafening news, or the deafening silence around news on devices. I think it was particularly disappointing that Samsung chose London 3 days before CTIA started to announce their new device rather than launch it at CTIA, and the United States, which is their most important market and where they have really a lot of close relationships, and that really built their smartphone leadership on which they're so proud on. And I really don't know why they, in a way, disrespected the U.S. in such a significant degree. At the same time, what was very disappointing was that both Google and Microsoft that had significant presences at CES and the Mobile World Congress had none at all at CTIA, and that is disappointing, especially when the premier U.S. event is being sidelined. And what we saw were then more like smaller providers. There was Unecto and Plum Mobile, and they were coming in at the very low end with two SIM slots, and are sold, in an unlocked fashion. And I think that is a very interesting development that comes to the U.S. from the developing markets, where we have so many dual SIM or even triple SIM devices, and people are using multiple SIMs to optimize their network choice. And I think with the U.S. having penetrated now so far down in the economic scale, where basically everybody who wants to have a postpaid phone has one, and we're heavily going into the prepaid segment, I think this is a very telltale sign that these two Chinese providers think that there's a market for them here.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you're right about kind of the lack of participation there from some of the bigger companies. It was, walking around the floor a little bit. I mean, I think the biggest booth might have been maybe for HTC and perhaps LG, I guess, are the two that maybe had the biggest presence, where, kind of larger, more established guys like you said, Samsung and even Nokia. I don't think I saw them around much there either.
Basically, Samsung, Motorola, RIM, Nokia, and Sony had no presence on the show floor. Nokia decided to pool their resources on end customer-facing items, and that was the rationale. Besides not having a presence there, but the lack of presence by the other providers was was puzzling. And when we look at LG, they were very, very tight-lipped, and some people are speculating that, they want to become more Apple-like in their information policy and get more mystique around it. But I think the first step to that is create, smartphones that inspire the fantasy rather than just choke off because that's the danger, that they just choke off anybody talking about them.
Yeah, that's a great point too. It does seem like maybe there's a lot of people trying to mimic that Apple model, at least when it comes to disseminating information and making it a little more unique. I know, I guess Samsung, announcing their new device the week before the show at a special event, like you mentioned in London, was perhaps a way for them to do that. But again, unless you have that kind of almost cult-like following, it seems like that's kind of a hard game to play, especially going against Apple in that front at least. So. Yeah, so I don't know, Darrell, if you had a chance to get a view of kind of the device side. I know you're more of a network guy, but I don't know if you saw anything on the device side that might have got your attention, or something that you perhaps noted while you're at the show.
Sure. First of all, I'll reiterate what Roger said. As the infrastructure guy, I don't spend as much time watching devices, but generally at most shows, there's at least one or two things on the device side that's so big it even cuts through my professional blinders. But there's really nothing at this show. But I did see a few things. I certainly thought, Huawei did a nice job in terms of at least, their booth and displaying other handsets. I know they want to, do more in this market, not always be like a white label handset, but, start building some of the brand that way. So, I thought they did a nice job in that. And then, I saw a couple other interesting things that probably just don't maybe always sit on the device side, but certainly was pleased over at Nokia Siemens Networks. They had a whole display of different TD, LTE type devices, data dongles, CTE, things of that nature, bringing in from the Motorola heritage of the Motorola Infrastructure division that they purchased there. And certainly, with the new technology like that, I think when you have the infrastructure company and you can at least seed the market with some basic devices, it certainly helps them from a competitive standpoint. And also, Ericsson did announce an LTE business gateway with Verizon, which I thought was, again, another way of helping to seed the market, and was pretty pleased to see that type of effort coming out of Ericsson.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, too. You're right. There was, I guess, I would say there was a good mix of I guess, enterprise side announcements when it came to devices. I know I had a couple of meetings with some carriers, and that was something they were kind of pushing more and more, is kind of on the enterprise side of things. And so, obviously without RIM being there, who's kind of really focused on that, maybe took away some of that, but there was at least it did seem like some good focus on the enterprise side, and like you mentioned too on the TD LTE side, I know that's a technology that's going to start gaining some steam here. I think at least domestically, probably next year with Clearwire, and I know they're working with China Mobile on developing that. So it seems like that's one of those markets that could have some potential going into next year. But also to your point there, Roger, as well, about kind of the new guys on the planet. That was interesting to kind of see the Plum Wireless and some of those smaller guys kind of come to the forefront, I guess, with the big guys, going elsewhere. It does seem like these smaller, I don't know how small they really are, but these new players to really kind of get a foothold in the domestic market at least.
Yeah, and by the way, it's really to a certain extent it kind of shot the bigger companies in the foot, because the spots on the show floor are being assigned by how long you have been a member of CTIA, and how long continuously you have presented at the show. So if the Samsungs and the Nokias and all the others are coming back, they will not be on the main aisle, because they decide they have to jump back at the end of the queue again of how that gets assigned. Yeah,
that's a good point too. Good point too. Well, we'll try to move on to our next topic here as well. And also, I want to remind everyone listening in that if you do have any questions for either Roger or Darrell, please feel free to use the question tab there in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will try to get some questions for the last 15 minutes or so of this call. So go ahead and use that and send those in. So for our next kind of topic there, kind of look at, I guess, some of the carrier news from the event. Obviously, carriers still pretty much dominate the domestic market. They kind of set the agenda for everybody else to follow, perhaps say for Apple at this point. But it did seem like one of the most well-attended events at the show was the carrier keynote, where we had the CEOs from all the big carriers there. And unlike last year, there was actually four CEOs in attendance this year, which was a nice thing to see. I don't know, Roger, if you had any kind of views on the carriers from the event.
Well, I think, the carrier keynotes clearly showed that there's a lot of competition in this market. When you saw with the four CEOs jockeying, for position and also differentiating themselves from each other, was quite significant. And one of the things that I found very interesting was Sprint actually coming out with a security focus and claiming that the industry is not very highly trusted. I was very surprised by that. The industry might get a little bit of might get a bad rep for not living up to the expectations of the customers, but from everything I have seen, the carriers are among the most trusted companies in America, period, with privacy and billing information. It's the industry just has done a, and you can't say it in any different way, a particularly bad job in celebrating its successes. When today people are complaining that their smartphone doesn't work that well, or the video call dropped, or you name it. 5 years ago, 100% of video calls didn't work because they didn't have a network and a device to support it. And would you rather have no capabilities or have some that glitch once every 200 times? Overall, otherwise, AT&T and Verizon were jockeying. Well, T-Mobile was jockeying that they were faster than everybody else, and Verizon was saying they had the biggest 4G LTE network, and AT&T had the biggest 4G network, and everybody was scratching their head. A little bit the confusion that is creating is not helping. The other thing I thought was very interesting was T-Mobile couldn't stop talking about the merger that didn't happen, and why they weren't there the last time. It's like, at least the other three carriers looked forward and wanted to see what's happening there. I also want to touch on Chairman Janikowski's comments. I think it would help everybody if we would elevate a little bit the level of conversation but I thought his comment that he can't understand how AT&T can have a spectrum crunch when the total available spectrum is unchanged is a little bit about wondering why people drown in the desert when there's enough water on the planet. It's like, who has it is the important part, and I think everybody in the industry and agrees on that and knows that we need to have more spectrum to drive innovation, to drive application providers, and that will be the topic of the fall show. That has created such a tremendous ecosphere, and we only can continue that with more spectrum because consumers demand it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I know we're going to touch a little bit later on Janikowski's comments, but also what you kind of brought up too about maybe raising the conversation to something maybe on a more mature level. I did find it funny that during that carrier keynote that again you have these CEOs who are supposed to be kind of above the fray, I guess, sniping about the whole speed and coverage of their LTE or 4G whatever networks, and it just seems odd to be able to do that in a forum where most of the people in attendance are aware of the technologies and aware of the limitations, and to kind of bring that consumer commercial aspect of it to a trade event seems odd.
But they're so competitive. They're so, these are all guys that are fighting in the trenches, and they're leading their troops, and it's like instinctive. It's like, if they would be all nice and slap each other's backs and congratulate on how well they do, I would be concerned of how competitive that market is. But they are four Rottweilers going at each other, and even at an event, at an industry event, they're so much in attack mode against each other and are so competitive. It's actually a good sign. Yeah,
that's true. That's probably a good point too. Good point. Well, I don't know, Daryl, if you had any comments or if any sort of meetings with people who kind of talked a bit about how the carriers kind of showed themselves at the show this year.
Mainly just a lot of comments about being contentious. That was just the main comment. From the infrastructure side, they aren't going to really talk much about it because those are all their customers.
And what was also interesting and nice is that the Suriorden, the CEO of Cellcom, is now president, a chairman of CTIA, and it's 14th largest carrier, and it's good that that the smaller carriers are heading at the table now and having their say also at CTIA. Not that they didn't have it before, but there was always this almost the setup of CTIA for the big carriers, RCA for the small carriers, and I think it actually CTIA is the association for all the carriers.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
And the whole industry.
More of a say in it. So that's interesting there too. Well, this kind of segues into maybe a little sub-segment of this topic here. While we're at the show, obviously there's always rumors when it comes to the wireless space and wireless carriers. And one thing that came out during the event was, I guess, T-Mobile and Metro having spoken or talked about a potential partnership of some sort. And obviously these types of rumors come and go. It seems like on a weekly basis when it comes to maybe carriers that are struggling. I don't know, Roger, if you had any I guess, general comments on maybe not this rumor in particular, but just kind of this constant, insider sources claiming these things are in the works. I don't know if you've seen it, or maybe specifically to this one, if it even made sense to go that way for these guys.
Yeah, I think this comes right out of the tall tales section of the news cycle. There is a lot of talk about mergers and others, and I almost look at it as an attempt to manipulate almost the market, where people are playing the stocks and then they throw out a comment. Yeah. And what I always look at when stories like that come out is, who is the lead journalist that is really writing the story? And for this story, it was a journalist that was actually covering the investment banking industry, not a telecom journalist. And that's all I needed to know. And by the merits behind it, why T-Mobile and Metro would make a good fit is beyond me. it's almost like, and I love that metaphor, it's like two drowning people trying to cling at each other in an attempt to swim better.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Isn't that what always happens, though?
Well, I think the
it's the one thing I remember from lifeguarding.
well, but it happens at times. But I think the Sprint Nextel example is vividly in everybody's mind that bigger is not better or not always better. And go ahead.
Also, but I think there are some areas where it would make sense in terms of, Metro PCS, their spectrum holdings are in, 1900 and AWS, which matches up well with what T-Mobile has. And also the fact that Metro PCS's AWS spectrum is fairly small, so, that's where they're deploying their LTE, but the bands aren't big enough really to give them an advantage on their own.
Yeah, and the technology doesn't work together and minor issues like that,
But combining their AWS with T-Mobile's AWS and doing joint LTE there would certainly benefit both of them in that area. The ugly part is the CDMA, and what do you do with that? Are you going to continue to run to CDMA? And that certainly gets to your point, the nightmare of IDEN and CDMA, or with what Metro PCS has about 9.5 million subs. Look to come up with a strategy to move them over to HSPA on the 1900 megahertz.
It will take overall Sprint about 10 years to shut down the IDEN network and untold pain and suffering.
Right. Oh no, there's definitely a lot of pain and suffering. But I would think Metro PCS might be a little bit easier because so much of their stuff is prepaid. So in terms of starting to see the market, since you don't have the contracts that way.
Yeah, but the other thing is, like, how do you position that carrier? Who is really your customer?
Right. It's always not ideal, but there's some logic behind why it could possibly happen. Not to say that.
But then, who's going to pay for this? Neither T-Mobile nor Metro is particularly flush with money. Minor detail. It's like money. Who needs
the money
that?
part, that's always the tricky part. But no, but it's a good point you brought up, Roger, too, just about that whole Sprint and Nextel thing, still being fresh in people's minds. Obviously, I guess to Daryl's point, the spectrum part of the Sprint Nextel deal, made sense. Obviously, it was able to bring together a vast 2.5 gigahertz spectrum position, and also, there was some 1.9 that Nextel was getting, and the eventual rebanding at 800 megahertz. The spectrum part of it always seems to make sense, but the operational side of things seems to be the part where I think most people in the industry, kind of roll their eyes and question the logic, because obviously with Sprint, it's been nothing but a headache. It seems like trying to integrate Nextel, and again, like you said, Daryl, too. It's more prepaid for Metro, so perhaps that's not such a big issue. But for either carrier to have to be tied up, it seems like trying to integrate with another carrier at this point in time, where it's so competitive out there, and to lose any sort of advantage like what T-Mobile did last year by being tied up for 9 months. Like that's, but you don't want to deal with that.
And T-Mobile, or at least its parent, Deutsche Telekom, says it wants to leave the U.S. So they're not going to buy Metro, and I don't think Metro has 39 billion or even 30 billion to buy T-Mobile.
Well, that's what makes these fun. Rumors are always one of those things that let you kind of step back and look at the potential release. But that was that was just kind of one of those interesting ones that came out during the event, and something that seems to pop up on a regular basis. But we'll move on to our next topic here. I think our final topic, and also I want to remind everyone too that who are listening in that if you did have some questions for myself or for Roger or for Darrell, you can use the question tab there in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can send those questions in, type them in there, and we'll get to those questions towards the end of the event here, probably in the next 10 minutes or so. So, well, going on to our kind of our final topic, which is kind of a catch-all topic, kind of looking at some of the single things that kind of came out of the event. Here's just a few that kind of caught my eye. Roger, you kind of mentioned earlier about Janikowski's comments about the spectrum crunch and whether there really is a crunch there. I don't know if you had maybe additional comments on that, or Daryl, maybe head to you next on that one too, so you can get your comment. But Roger, I don't know if you want to follow up a little bit on your view on that spectrum crunch.
Well, if we look at at the spectrum crunch, we are seeing the leading smartphone providers having real problems in New York and San Francisco and other leading markets. And we can, if we just project that out a little bit further, we see everybody running out of effectively spectrum by like 2015, 2016. And so or having significant problem and having to steer spectrum usage, at least in some of the bands. LTE will provide some headroom, but we need spectrum. And when you see how slowly the NTIA is moving with making spectrum available, it's very frustrating. The problem is we should have started with this 5 years ago, but 5 years ago there was no iPhone, or the iPhone just came out. If anybody would have said, well, in 5 years, a lot of wireless carriers will have run out of the money and will start running out of spectrum in large markets, and a consumer will use between 1 and 2 megabytes of data a month, everybody would have said you're absolutely nuts, and so the administration has a very good goal of providing the industry with 500 megahertz of spectrum. We just need the reality of actually delivering it. There's the plan that the FCC has to, or it's a law actually, that the FCC has to auction the 1755 band, and I think where are we now? GH band, if it makes sense, and that is spectrum that we particularly need, and especially the H will be particularly valuable because it's right in the PCS band, and so that will work very nicely. So from that perspective, if somebody today wants to say we don't have a spectrum crunch right now, I'm going to say yes, but we're in a fast car riding towards the abyss, and the road is clear.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, Daryl, if you're talking to some of the vendors, if they had any sort of view on kind of that spectrum issue. I mean, obviously they're working hard on trying to make it the most efficient use possible of the spectrum that's out there. But if there's any sort of view from those guys when it came to kind of the spectrum issue right now with the industry.
Yeah, I mean, generally the approach is that you need everything that you can. I mean, they would love to see more spectrum, freed up in the United States. But of course, sometimes they're concerned about some of the bands they're talking about. Are they common bands? How close they are to other stuff that's been deployed? I mean, that seems to be some of the issue. At the same time, that's when you get back to small cells or DAS or Wi-Fi or any of those other tools in the toolbox that they can offer to the mobile operator to, obviously optimize the spectrum that they do have. I mean, like I said, certainly it's a problem. It's not a uniform problem. I mean, across an operator, some areas are worse than other areas, and some operators are in worse condition than other operators.
Yeah.
But certainly overall, I mean, as you continue to see more and more traffic go mobile, this is going to become a problem, and there just doesn't really seem to be a totally uniform way of approaching it.
Yeah, well, and it's a geographic problem. It's highly doubtful we will run out of spectrum in Wyoming or in Idaho or some other, north or the Dakotas.
Right.
But it's, even with what we have today, but it's the big markets, top 30 markets where the writing is on the wall. And, the funny thing is, there's the incentive auction coming in the next 10 years, you know. No kidding, in the next 10 years. And you know, I think the auction in all likelihood will succeed in all the smaller markets, because wireless and the broadcast industry works with a pretty similar ingredient, and that is population density.
Mm-hmm.
If in the highly densely populated market, the broadcast TV model is still working. In rural America, it's like shoveling money in a hole, and it disappears. So they will sell all the spectrum where nobody wants to have it anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point there. And then I guess maybe kind of one final topic here before we get to the Q&A part. I guess we can kind of combine these together, but this is, you know, kind of, I guess, looking at the show in general. Obviously, this year CTIA moved the show back a couple of months to perhaps give it some breathing room from the earlier shows on the schedule. And obviously there was a lot of talk, at least from what I heard at the show, from people attending about, you know, possibly combining the show or put the show in the fall or some sort of movement there. I don't know, maybe Daryl, if you know, kind of what your view was of maybe the date change this year. It did have a big impact, and maybe what you heard when it comes to possibly moving the two events to perhaps one event later, even later in the year.
I think, you know, generally overall, I mean, all for the location. No offense to any, you know, Las Vegas or Orlando listeners that may be on today, but more shows should be in New Orleans on a regular basis. But I think the show would be much better off in the fall. It's still just too close to Mobile World Congress, and that's still being, you know, that's going to be the biggest show. That kind of saps some of the strength from the CTIA show. And I think it would be much better pursued in the fall time.
Yeah. I don't know, Roger, if you had any sort of comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think where later in the year was certainly better, because Mobile World Congress and CES, less this year CES, took all the oxygen out of the room. Yeah. I think if CTIA becomes, you know, the announcement show for, you know, devices for the Christmas season, for the holiday season, might help on that avenue, and make it basically, you know, the two shows to go to are Barcelona and CTIA, and they're 6 months roughly apart, probably a little bit more, because nobody wants to go in August to one of the convention center, cities, because that's one of the big problems is the wireless CTIA is a big show, and there are only a few cities that can actually host it, because you need a convention center and hotel rooms for it. Yeah. Because you don't want to have that, and that's what led Mobile World Congress to move from Cannes to Barcelona. And still, if you've been to Barcelona and you haven't, or if you're planning to go to Barcelona, you have to book a hotel room now, because otherwise it's a 100, like a 60-mile one-way trip from your hotel room in Lloret del Mar or whatever the place is. Yeah. And so they have to do it. If they want to do it, they have to do it later in the year, when it's not that muggy, not that hot, where you actually, because I love New Orleans. I love New Orleans a little bit better in say March, because the humidity is not there, and that was the only downside by doing it in May, that the humidity was already there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's definitely Daryl's point too. It was nice to be back in New Orleans. I think it's been 7 years or so since CTIA was there, at least, and it was definitely good to go back there. You know, obviously March is probably a little extra time, but May wasn't too bad either. So anyway, well, those were most of our major topics. I wanted to definitely, like you said, leave some time for some questions, and I see that we have quite a few questions that have rolled in, so we'll get to those now. And the ones that we don't get to, like you mentioned earlier, please feel free to follow up with us individually if you like, with the email addresses there to get those answered. But getting to the questions, it looks like we had a couple that came in I guess, asking about any sort of DAS or more the small cell announcements from the show. Maybe Darrell, I know you touched on that a little bit, but I guess maybe get your view on kind of how DAS and maybe in building and small cells kind of fared at the event. Did you see some good announcements there, or what's your general view on that sector?
You know, DAS is an interesting market. I realize it's quite big, in the billions of dollars of big annually. But to be honest with you, I mean, I don't hear it. It just doesn't seem to get quite the coverage as the other parts of the infrastructure in terms of small cells or macro cells. So I mean, to say I was not approached, did not come across my radar any major type DAS announcements. I mean, certainly I had discussions with different people there in terms of, you know, DAS is still a part of the operator's strategy, especially, you know, obviously getting into in-building, because, I mean, as much as you say about wireless, at least on the wireless infrastructure side, I mean, the pat answer is it always depends. There's no one thing for all operators, and I mean, and DAS fits right in there in terms of a solution that's available today, certainly reaching those getting to those hard to reach areas indoors. So I mean, people are still using DAS, but it just does not seem to get the kind of coverage that you would think from an industry as big as it is.
Yeah, I don't know, Roger, if you had heard anything kind of on that front as well. I mean, you mentioned kind of when it comes to spectrum, obviously DAS is a way to perhaps maximize spectrum usage, but if you heard any comments from your meetings with people on
yeah, and you know, Verizon just installed its DAS system, you know, in the Memorial Convention Center to cover this, and so there are. I look at DAS like at plumbing. You know, it's not terribly exciting, but you need it, and so, how many headlines do plumbers make?
But when you need them, you need them. That's for sure.
You need them, absolutely, and if it doesn't work, you have a serious problem.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, Darrell, did you maybe hear any more about, I guess, maybe like on Wi-Fi offload as a potential? I know, at least for myself, talking to some of the carriers, there was maybe some more talk about using Wi-Fi as a potential offload as opposed to a DAS or a small cell.
From a solution side, yeah, I mean, there was plenty about it. I mean, it's right there with Wi-Fi. You saw, you know, Bell Air's now there on the Ericsson pad.
Yeah.
NSN announced a deal with Ruckus Wireless in terms of distributing their solutions. I saw a pretty interesting company I actually hadn't seen before called Edgewater, who's talking about a carrier access point type solution that allows them to use all three channels at one time. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there was definitely plenty of carrier Wi-Fi solutions being shown. There are plenty of carrier Wi-Fi discussions going on. I mean, you also had other people on the spectrum there showing stuff. I mean, DeviceScape working on their crowdsourcing. You also had different people showing software clients for the devices. Even, you know, discussion around ANDSF in terms of where that's going development-wise.
Yeah, interesting.
And certainly when you talk to the people about small cells, I mean, it's not Wi-Fi or small cells, it's Wi-Fi and small cells. And in the future, that and is going to be actually inside the exact package.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, I did talk to some people there, and that seems to be kind of where it's moving, is integrating Wi-Fi into a DAS or a small cell, picocell solution, having it all as one package, one little box, I guess. So, well, it looks like some other questions here that come in. I guess on the topic of competition amongst the big carriers, someone was asking about the possibility. I mean, I know, Roger, you mentioned that there's not a lot of money from the smaller guys involved right now to make an acquisition possible, but maybe someone like Latin America, Movalis, maybe coming in. You know, they obviously have big pockets, big deep pockets. They're starting to make some noise in Europe as well. But perhaps someone like that, perhaps coming in and consolidating maybe some of these smaller guys into a stronger number 3 or number 4 carrier. I mean, obviously they've got TracFone right now in the U.S., which is on the prepaid side doing pretty well. But do you think something like that could be a possibility for bringing these small guys together?
Well, I think, Carlos Slim is, you know, very smart, very shrewd businessman. He didn't become the richest man in the world if he couldn't count his pesos and his dollars.
Yep.
He is today the 5th largest service provider in this country, and is quite profitable, and has excellent relationships with all the major and most of the smaller wireless carriers. If he would come in, and it's a business model that's working, it's quite profitable for him. If he would come in and buy one of the struggling providers, what would happen? He would buy a struggling provider, which he typically does not do, and on top of it, would lose all the relationships that TracFone has at this time. A lot of people don't like to do enable their competitors, and so I think the strategy that America Mobilis has set for themselves in the U.S. is largely that of being a reseller, and success, proves that strategy right.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. They've done a pretty good job in their market. I mean, and like you said, too, they're working with everybody, and whenever they announce a new offering or new deal with Walmart or somebody, they seem to get a lot of praise from, or at least deals with the bigger carriers. So they seem to have a pretty good relationship right now with everybody in the market.
And they have done, and TracFone has done a wonderful tiered market strategy. From Safelink, they're the largest provider of lifeline services in the U.S. To the traditional TracFone, then they're Net 10, but especially their Straight Talk has really made a huge difference for them.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I mean, I can definitely see where people might think that could be an option, but like you said, they definitely are in a pretty good position right now. So I can't see them jeopardizing that at this point. So
too much.
Another question here coming in from someone, I guess, asking about Clearwire's, I guess, prospects. I know they were talking about kind of moving into with their LTE strategy. Kind of going into densifying, I guess, markets, some of the big markets like we were talking about where there's some spectrum issues. Obviously, Clearwire's got a lot of spectrum in those big markets, and with their plans to roll out LTE, and with TD-LTE kind of starting to be supported at some point here in chipsets, there could be some potential there for some partnerships with some of the larger carriers. I mean, obviously, they're tied to Sprint right now. That could scare off some people. They do have a deal with Leap that'll come into play at some point. I don't know, Roger, if you I guess your view of Clearwire's plans, and if they could, at some point garner some more interest from some of the bigger carriers out there.
Well, the saving grace for Leap is that Qualcomm has a chipset that does TD-LTE and FD-LTE on the same chip. Without that, they would be condemned in the Sprint to work with Sprint. When you look at the announcement, the other announcements that Clearwire did, you mentioned Leap, that follows in the footsteps of the announcement that these carriers have done with Sprint. Because if you do nationwide calling or wherever you are with Leap and Metro, you're actually on Sprint's network. So I could very well see Metro to do the same thing. And have a deal there. The problem is always you need a different chipset in the phone that can do both that can do TD-LTE. That's the big problem. It's another set of electronics, uses more power, uses more room, and raises the bill of materials, and you need it built just for you.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, obviously having Qualcomm at least commit to it is a good start, but there's still an issue of getting it out there. So, I mean, maybe for you, Darrell, too. I guess on the topic of Clearwire. I mean, obviously, they're expected to announce some their vendors coming coming up, I think, in the third quarter, and maybe some vendor financing. How is the vendor community looking at Clearwire right now? I mean, do they see a potential there? Are they still kind of worried about the financials there, or what's kind of the view of Clearwire's plans with LTE?
Like I said, they don't speak to the financials part of me, but certainly they all have an interest in Clearwire, one, just for building another stakeholder in the TD-LTE market. I mean, I think, I was trying to think, there was actually, two announcements coming out there. I mean, you had the Qualcomm support, and you also had Sequence talk, announce a deal with them in terms of chipsets for supporting Clearwire. And my understanding, also being part of the Qualcomm's roadmap is to have the one chipset that'll do both the TD and the FDD eventually to help them with electronics. In terms of the infrastructure side of it, certainly, I mean, Huawei, that's probably one of their biggest clients here in the United States. And, another one for Samsung as well. And all these, infrastructure guys are seeing, TD-LTE as you start to look, say, further down the roadmap, and then you start working through all the different solutions to deal with spectrum crunch. I mean, they certainly see eventually a future where, you will see more TDD and FDD coming from the same operators just to address that limited spectrum issue, especially with unpaired spectrum being at such a lower price than paired spectrum.
Yeah, it's a good point. Good point. Maybe we'll squeeze in one more final question here at the end. Not much time for it, but we'll see what we can do. Someone asking about the M2M market. They mentioned they didn't really hear much coming out of that space from the show. I don't know, Roger, if you saw any machine-to-machine announcements, or how you kind of see that market kind of coming out of the event.
Well, the one big M2M announcement at the show came from AT&T and their digital home. Yeah, digital life. And journalists and analysts were brought to a house in New Orleans that was fully decked out with all the different tools, cameras, door locks, kitchen equipment, main water main, fail safe switches, which, coming back to plumbing is a major issue, because water is the most destructive thing that ruins your house, not fire. And here they have a tool that if there's water, it automatically shuts off the water main and reports it then to everybody. So that was the major, and AT&T did it quite nicely. It was good to see it like in action, and but that was the major machine-to-machine announcement at the show.
Yeah. I don't know, Darrell, did you see anything in that sector that maybe caught your attention or that kind of stood out for you?
Just the AT&T one. Yeah,
it definitely seemed like that was kind of the big one from the event when it came to this. I mean, obviously that's one of those sectors that carriers are kind of still grappling with how to penetrate that market. But at least looking from the AT&T example, there's plenty of potential out there. It's just a matter of, I guess, of getting consumers to jump on board. I mean, I think we've been hearing for years about your refrigerator talking to your toaster and talking to your coffee maker and stuff like that. But when it comes to in-home stuff, that's still one of those issues that's still, I guess, trying to find its right space. So, well, anyway, we're just about out of time here for the webinar. I want to again thank everyone for sending the questions. If we didn't get to one of your questions, if you have some follow-up questions, please feel free to shoot an email off to either myself, to Roger or Darrell. There's the email addresses there on the screen. We'll try to follow up with you that way. But again, I want to say thanks to our panel members, to Roger from Recon Analytics, and to Darrell from Ovum. Thanks again for their participation today, guys. We definitely appreciate that. And I also would like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, CommScope. And again, thanks everyone for joining us today. And we'll hopefully hear from you on some future webinars. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.